One of my prized possessions is a book written by the late Republican columnist James Kilpatrick and the late Democratic Senator Eugene McCarthy from the 1970s. It was a Washington bestiary, all of the different breeds and species in Washington. And so I've often thought that to understand this place and similar world capitals, you sort of need a zoologist. And we don't have a zoologist today, but we have an anthropologist. Janine Woodell, who's a professor of public policy at George Mason University and a very distinguished fellow here at the New America Foundation. And already in her career, she has gathered accolades for her very creative and provocative application of anthropology to the world of advanced tribes in both in Europe and in the United States. She has been a Fulbright Fellow 4 times and has won awards from the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and many more. The Foreign Policy Association selected her prize-winning Collision and Collusion, The Strange Case of Western Aid to Eastern Europe, as an editor's pick in 2001. And she's the author of a number of other celebrated studies. She's written for the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and many other journals. In addition, she has won the Grawemeyer Award, an honor which she is also, whose other recipients include the late Samuel P. Huntington and Mikhail Gorbachev. But I wouldn't draw anything about her, any conclusions about her opinions from those she shared the award with. Her subject today is something that's both fascinating and of profound importance, both in our society and in similar societies around the world, and that's the changing nature of influence, including corruption, in advanced industrial societies. Edmund Burke, in his reflections on the French Revolution, says, I'm quoting from memory, we're gibbeting and hunting down evil in its old form, but it's escaped us, and meanwhile, unseen, it's appeared in some new form. And there's this constant adaptation of corruption. And it's not a subject that one discusses very much, except in terms of individual blatant scandals. But obviously it's an enormous threat, institutionalized systemic corruption, that is defined she can define it herself, but defined as the abuse of institutional roles and the blurring of boundaries. And it's a threat, as we know from experience in this country and others, to a functioning constitutional system, to a democratic republic, and to a free enterprise system, which relies on trust and on information and transparency. So please join me in welcoming Janine Wedel to talk about her book, Shadow Elite: How the World's New Power Brokers Undermine Democracy, Government, and the Free Market.
Thank you so much for that very nice introduction. I feel like I should be discovering a new tribe here today or something. Thank you for coming. I'm delighted to see you here. And I'd like to say first a few words about what the book is about, and then address some questions that I'm frequently asked. So, what is Shadow Elite about? It's about the new system of power and influence that surfaced over the past decades. This system undermines democracy, government, and the free market. One of its manifestations is that governments and administrations come and go, but the shadow elite remains. The protagonists in the new system are largely beyond democratic input and boundaries set by standard means of accountability. So they don't fit neatly into the political dichotomies of the day, left versus right, Tea Parties, or MoveOn.org versus Tea Parties. How did I come to this conclusion? Well, my work as a social anthropologist in Eastern Europe over 30 years helped me put together pieces of the puzzle. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, I'd already spent about 4 years in Poland with Fulbright and other fellowships when the nation was under martial law. I had written about the under-the-table dealings and networks that people develop to survive shortages and other consequences wrought by centrally planned systems. When the wall fell, I set out to study how these same dealings and networks, which both undergirded and undermined centrally planning, how they operated to shape the emerging system. And when foreign assistance, mostly in the form of consultants, descended on Poland and other countries of the region in the early 1990s, I also studied their impact on emerging democracies. During this period, I was interviewing top-level officials in the post-communist government, many of them former underground activists. And a practice among these officials, I'm talking about ministers, deputy ministers of, say, privatization, energy, and so on, a practice caught my attention because it kept repeating itself. When interviews with officials were winding down or turning more personal, they'd hand me their official government card, followed by a slew of other cards, and then confide that, in my addition to my government job, I also had a consulting firm. And then I'd learned that sometimes that consulting firm does business with the government agency. And my wife has an NGO, of course, financed by a Western foundation, and I'm chair of the board. So almost always their roles overlapped and influenced each other. And this experience repeated itself time and time again in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and after the Soviet Union broke apart in Russia and Ukraine. At the time, I thought, well, this is a symptom of the sprint away for communism, because when a command system of a centrally planned state that's owned virtually everything breaks down, and no authoritarian stand-in is put in its place, a network-based governing and business develops to replace it. Think of Iraq. At the time in Eastern Europe, long-standing networks positioned themselves right at the state-private nexus and rose to fill leadership vacuums and at times to reap the spoils of previously state-owned wealth. These groups became known as clans in Russia and institutional nomads in Poland, and by still other means necessary, other names elsewhere. Institutional nomads are so named by Polish sociologists because their primary loyalty is to their tight-knit network rather than to the many institutions with which they're affiliated. They're officials, top-level officials in governmental and non-governmental organizations, national branches of banks, foundations, etc. And they use these institutions to secure the power and resources necessary to further the goals of their network. But again, their primary loyalty is to the network. These nomadic networks were key players in the immediate post-communist years, especially, but they still hold sway today. One such network, very visible in the 1990s and known as Ordynacka, counts among its ranks the popular Aleksander Kwaśniewski, president of Poland for 10 years until 2005. Ordynacka can't be reduced to a political party, an NGO, social club, business or lobbying organization. It does all of those things, and its influence can be seen in politics, the economy, and certainly media. Now, fast forward from transitional Eastern Europe to this decade in the United States. I began to recognize a familiar architecture, and we weren't moving away from communism. I started to follow networks and overlapping connections in government, foundations, think tanks, and business of a tiny set of neoconservatives, just a dozen or so players with Richard Pearl as the linchpin. I call this small group the Neocon Core, as distinct, of course, from the much, much larger neoconservative movement of people brought together by ideological, just by views. This is a network-based group. Some members of this core have been working together for 30 years to remake American foreign policy according to their own vision. The modus operandi, and this is what I'm focused on, the modus operandi of this core bears striking similarity to networks that shaped government, business, politics in Eastern Europe. In both cases, a network of players, both with people both in and out of government, straddles official and private organizations. In both cases, the players set up a host of organizations, lots of different organizations, but they're all populated by more or less the same collection of people. So the same collection of people keeps coming up and up, but in different incarnations as suits their agendas. And in both cases, both Eastern Europe and the case of the Neocon Core, the players achieve their agendas by bypassing or frustrating government. That is, they bypass or frustrate the rules, standard processes, and bureaucracies. Bureaucracy is a very important part of this. They frustrate the bureaucracy of the governments they serve and create and supplant those bureaucracies with their own living systems. The most vital function of networks like the Neocon Core is to acquire and create official information. They construct alternative official versions and brand them as the most reliable versions. From Team B in the 1970s and long-time promotion of missile defense to the current war in Iraq and their hoped-for regime change via U.S. intercession in Iran, they've challenged official U.S. intelligence and marketed and market is an important part, they've marketed their own versions as the definitive ones. Most recently, think Ahmed Chalabi and the dissemination of his information in government and in the media. The Neocon Core and networks like it are self-propelling, interlocking, multi-purpose, and enduring. I argue that terms from political science like lobbyist and interest group are hardly adequate to describe these networks of unannounced and unincorporated operators. I call them flex nets. Flex nets are more amorphous and less transparent than conventional lobbies and interest groups, yet conversely more coherent. Now, the new breed of influencers don't always work together in these tight-knit networks. They can also work as individuals, whom I call flexians. In the book, I offer a lot of examples of flexians ranging from prominent economists and academics / government officials and consultants to lesser-known operators. And let me just give a few examples here of flexians from recent newspapers. Last fall, the New York Times exposed the activities of some 50 retired generals who were pronouncing publicly on the conduct of the Iraq War. What the public did not know was that these supposedly unbiased experts were receiving undisclosed perks and briefings on Iraq from the Pentagon that was ostensibly hoping to shape their opinions. Take General Barry Mccaffrey, for example. 4-star general, military analyst for the media, defense industry consultant, president of his own consulting firm, and part-time professor. I don't have enough hands. Crucial to Mccaffrey's success in these roles was special access, including trips to war zones arranged specifically for him, just for him, by the Pentagon and associates still in the military. He returned from these trips with information that proved useful in other roles. Media, for example. He appeared frequently as a commentator on TV, nearly 1,000 times on NBC and its affiliates, at a time when the administration was trying to convince the American people of the efficacy of U.S. intervention in Iraq. He was introduced in many guises as a Gulf War hero, a professor, and a decorated veteran, but not as an unofficial spokesperson for the Pentagon and its positions. In yet another role, Mccaffrey signed a consulting contract with one of many defense companies he had relationships with. According to the New York Times, he did the firm's bidding through his personal recommendations to General Petraeus, the commanding general in Iraq, to Congress and the media, venues in which he also praised Petraeus. Later, when Mccaffrey criticized the conduct of the war on the Today Show, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld cut off his invitations to the Pentagon briefings. Tellingly, Mccaffrey went back on the air, towed the Pentagon's line, and regained entry into those briefings. In an unrelated story, just 3 weeks ago, the New York Times, following revelations in Europe, wrote that Ambassador Peter Galbraith engaged in insider self-dealing while supposedly serving an altruistic agenda for the Kurdish people. Galbraith, a longtime champion of Kurdish autonomy, has worn many hats vis-a-vis Iraqi Kurdistan this decade. He advised Bush's Deputy Secretary of Defense on Kurdistan and helped draft the Iraqi constitution. Presenting himself as a disinterested expert, he published opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other outlets, staunchly advocating Kurdish independence and the right of the Kurds to control oil resources in their region. The right of the Kurds to control oil resources in their region. At the same time, we now know he acquired the potential to make up to $100 million in business dealings involving these same oil reserves. Now, what do these cases share? The case of the retired generals and Peter Galbraith. They share the pattern of overlapping, mutually influencing, and not fully disclosed professional roles. These players, Flexians, actively structure, indeed create their roles and involvements to serve their own agendas, often at the expense of the government agencies, shareholders, or publics on whose behalf they supposedly work. I argue that terms like conflict of interest do not accurately capture the full range of their activities. A more apt term would be coincidences of interest. They're creating these coincidences of interest. And I argue that far from being isolated examples, this is the modus operandi of many of today's most effective power brokers in America and beyond. Now, why should we care about this new system of power and influence? These players aren't necessarily unethical, and they're not necessarily doing anything wrong. But they're shaping the way we see things and making policy decisions, while leading us to think they're impartial, when in fact they're marching to drummers that we don't know about at the time. In the case of General Mccaffrey, for example, while millions of viewers, Congress, and General Petraeus were led to believe that he was offering his unbiased opinions, Mccaffrey's interlocking roles created incentives for him to offer less than impartial expertise. Meanwhile, all the institutions involved are complicit. No institution, from the Pentagon to defense contractors to the media, no institution has any incentive to be anything but complicit. And everyone has an out if questions are raised. The media can say they didn't know about conflicts. General Mccaffrey can claim to be wearing a different hat than he was wearing when he made X decision or promoted Y course of action. Contractors can say they didn't know, or they don't have to tell. And because only the individual Flexian bridges all these institutions and venues, only the institutional Flexian bridges them all, only he can connect all these dots. Everyone is fat and happy. Everyone, of course, except the public, which has virtually no way of knowing that these players have incentives to be less than impartial, much less means to do much about it. With regard to Peter Galbraith, associates in his non-business Iraq activities said they were unaware of his business goals. As a former Iraqi diplomat and legal advisor put it, the idea that a foreign oil company was in the room drafting the Iraqi constitution has me reeling. It casts a tremendous pall on the legitimacy of the process. And yet the public trusts such people for expertise about everything from the financial system and national security to healthcare reform and where we should be keeping our money. The point is that Flexians influence and make public decisions without public input, and the full range of their activities is almost always difficult to detect. Now, how can we recognize Flexians and Flexnets, that is, the shadow elite? Let me offer just a few features. There are a number of features that I've outlined in the book, but let me just offer a few features of the modus operandi of these power brokers and why Americans in particular are likely to overlook them. As we've seen, Flexians cannot be pinned down to any single professional role or organization or affiliation. As they actively construct their coincidences of interest, they work across government, business, think tanks, and national borders in pursuit of their own agendas. You could say that they're in these organizations, but they're not necessarily of them. They're in them, but not of them. They test, or they break, both governments' rules of accountability and businesses' rules or businesses' codes of competition to accomplish their goals. This means that their roles cannot be reduced to state or private, bureaucratic or market. Their influence, their impact comes from their very ability to blend and blur roles across these divides. So their influence comes from the ambiguity they create. And ambiguity is not a category that we talk about much in public policy. How did this new system come about? The new system is the product of an unprecedented confluence of 4 transformational developments that arose in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The first development is the redesign of governing, spawned by government outsourcing, contracting out, and deregulation, which was given great impetus in the Reagan and Thatcher eras. The second is the end of the Cold War, of relations dominated by 2 competing alliances. This opened up new, sparsely governed arenas that range from borders controlled by smugglers and corrupt officials to human rights policies set up by transnational advocacy networks to commerce regulated by money launderers and financial sectors organized by wizards of finance. The third transformational development is the advent of ever more complex technologies, especially information and communication technologies. These technologies lend themselves to new forms of power and influence that are neither bureaucratic nor centralized in traditional ways. Neither bureaucratic nor centralized in traditional ways, nor are they generally responsive to traditional means of accountability. So the result of these 3 transformational developments is many more opportunities for private players to make or influence public decisions. Many more opportunities. The result is that private players can much more easily control official information and decisions that once rested in the hands of states and international authorities. And while supposedly working on behalf of those authorities as, say, consultants, they can acquire information and use it for their own purposes, all the while eluding monitoring designed for the way the world once operated. Now, let me briefly state some manifestations of the interactions of these first three transformational developments in the United States. Much of federal governance now takes place outside of formal government. In fact, 3/4 of people working for federal government actually work for private companies as consultants. Private companies or NGOs or universities as private consultants. Further, the contracting out of many government functions is now routine. Contractors choose and oversee other contractors. They control crucial databases. They draft official documents. They run intelligence operations. Government bailouts and stimulus packages are managed and overseen by contractor firms that can hardly be said to be completely disinterested. In my Ford Foundation-sponsored New America project on outsourcing national security policy, I've learned that many public priorities and decisions are made by private companies instead of government officials and agencies that must answer to citizens, with officials simply then signing on the dotted line after the process is pretty much complete. In report after report by the General Accountability Office or inspectors general of various agencies, government investigators have raised questions about who drives policy, government or contractors, and whether government has the information, expertise, and institutional memory to manage contractors, or is it the other way around? A crucial issue here is information. In many cases, the governments and organizations for which the players ostensibly work don't know what's going on. I mean, 2 weeks ago, USA Today had a front page story about a Pentagon program in which retired military officers who are serving as senior mentors to armed forces as contractors. That is, they're paid directly by the contractors. How they're selected and the identity of their other contractors, their other relationships with business, with defense, and their pay, all of that information is locked up in a black box beyond government scrutiny. Even Representative Murtha, who chairs the Defense Committee of the House Appropriations Committee, reported that his committee had never heard of the program. The result of all of this is that new forms of governance are being created, forms that fuse state and private power. Until recently, these forms were perhaps most visible in intelligence, defense, and homeland security enterprises, where so much action has taken place since 9/11. The economic sector, one could say, is the current Exhibit A. The response to the economic crisis has intensified the intertwining of state and private power. Think, for example, about the term government sacks. Government sacks and what it implies. Well, it implies that inside information and power is confined to an interlocking handful of Wall Street/government players who intermingle with the beneficiaries of many of the bailouts and other policy decisions. These actors create not only the financial architecture of the future, backed by the power in billions of the state, but they create new relationships among bureaucracy and market more generally. New relationships among bureaucracy and market more generally. Again, this is reminiscent of transitional Eastern Europe. And it's happened just as fast here. The fourth and final transformational development, and this may surprise you, is what I call the embrace of truthiness. Truthiness. The term is coined by, but take this seriously, the term is coined by comedian Stephen Colbert, and it's defined as the quality of preferring concepts or facts one wishes to be true, rather than those known to be true. Frank Rich, the New York Times columnist, has traced the origins of truthiness to the mid-1990s, quote, when you simultaneously had the rise of cable news networks and the rise of the internet, unquote. Truthiness allows people to play with how they present themselves to the world, regardless of fact or track record. Regardless of fact or track record, and they often get away with it. Appearances of the moment have become all important. As comic Jon Stewart quipped, you cannot, in today's world, judge a book by its contents. Performing, as in theater, is required. It is required in today's public sphere. So the interaction of these four transformational developments, the redesign of governing, the end of the Cold War, the advent of ever more complex information technologies, and the embrace of truthiness, provide ample opportunities for today's top power brokers, the shadow elite, to weave new institutional forms of power and influence in which official and private power are interdependent and even reinforce each other. It allows them to do so with minimal public input or even notice. Gone are the messy disagreements and competing interests and involvement of a diversity of actors, that is, the democratic process. The final question I'd like to address is how the new system of power and influence differs from the past and why current accountability methods provide inadequate checks and balances. Today's Flexians and Flexnets, the shadow elite, are less visible, less stable, more elastic in their engagements, and more global in reach than their forebears. They also specialize in branding. That's top of their list. Standard means of accountability are largely impotent against their new forms of corruption. Public and government monitors are left with few real-time tools to unravel the activities of Flexians and the sticky interlocking relationships of Flexnets. If facts about these players are unearthed at all, it is usually not until long after the damage has been done. For instance, the revelations about Peter Galbraith are too late to avert bad PR. They can give fodder to those, Iraqi or otherwise, who believe that the United States and its allies invaded the Middle East for oil. Flexians and Flexnets are virtually immune from even after-the-fact sanctions. Take the lack of fallout from last fall's New York Times expose about Mccaffrey and the other retired generals. That episode shows journalism at its best. We know about the generals' multiple overlapping roles because the New York Times, underwrote an investigation which it featured on the front page. The journalist even won a Pulitzer for the story. But even with this best-case example, there were no adverse consequences that would do anything but further encourage such activity. TV and radio didn't pick up the story. There was no public outcry. When investigations do follow revelations, they are often off point. The government audit prompted by the Pentagon case, by the Mccaffrey and retired generals case, pursued a very narrow focus and found no misuse of taxpayer monies. The influence of Flexians and Flexnets reaches across organizations and nations, but a government auditor typically has limited jurisdiction. Gaston Gianni, a former inspector general with more than 40 years of government auditing experience, adds to this list that, quote, auditors generally don't get into the arena of who influences policy. The Flexians you describe are coming in when policy is being made, he told me. There are no processes in place to monitor them. If we find out what's going on at all, then it's too late to do anything about it. Indeed, the activities of the shadow elite, who colonize policy to serve their own agendas, are potentially much more harmful to the public and national interest than the abuse of taxpayer dollars. The new system of power and influence we find ourselves in is a trust-based system that can be no more accountable or transparent than the shadow elite itself. There is, of course, no way to police a trust-based system. This state of affairs poses a huge threat to a democratic society. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Okay, great. Okay, yes, lady in the turquoise. Yes, please identify yourselves and wait until the microphone.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I've worked with the Defense Department for the last 32 years, so I understand a lot about what you say. I guess my first question is, does your book have names?
Yes, it does have some names.
But not a lot.
No, I think the only way to explain, I think there are quite a lot of names, because really the only way to explain this phenomenon is
what people
through
do.
example,
Yeah,
and through
understand.
by charting the roles and activities of people is really the only way to get to the bottom of this phenomenon.
All right, so let me just ask you a question about, first, I guess there are two questions. One is, how would you fix it if you thought you could? And secondly, the whole business of when Reagan wanted to come in and cut government, nobody got rid of the work. You just found another way to pay for you found a way to pay for it, and it didn't show up on the books as federal headcount. So there are clearly ways if you decide to do it. It's my understanding that the Secretary of Defense has announced that there will be 285,000 new civilians hired for the Defense Department over the next 10 years. But that would mean moving the contractors back into federal jobs.
Right. Just starting with the second point first, I think one of the most interesting things about the evolution in American federal government over the past 50 years is that, but especially the last 20 years is when so many of the most dramatic last 15 years during the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, when so many of the dramatic changes have taken place, both in terms of the amount of contracting out and the rules under which it's done. But one of the most fascinating things is that we have created a ruse of limited government, of small government. And that has led us to keep these caps on government, on numbers of civil servants, on numbers of government officials. But meanwhile, of course, there are needs, and the federal government has continued to grow dramatically, and the way those needs are addressed is by contracting everything out. So what we're actually getting is a bigger, ever bigger government. In fact, it's an ever bigger government, but it's less accountable. But it's a shadow government, and it's less accountable. So I think one of the first things to do in terms of that issue is to start calling a spade a spade. Contracted out jobs where people are working for the federal government are federal jobs. First, get rid of this ruse, of this myth that we've been telling ourselves, and it's a bipartisan myth. I don't think that the contracting out or other aspects of the systems of the systems that I've mentioned lend themselves to any quick fix, unfortunately. It's very interconnected. These aspects are very interconnected and intertwined, and they're not easily redressed. I think the most important thing for us as citizens is to begin to recognize and to begin to read between the lines and not take things at face value so much. And I think auditors and people who have worked for many years in auditing there needs to be more of a discussion among them about how do we go about looking into some of these things. How do we look at begin to audit, to monitor contracted out programs where the agency that's actually responsible for the people, for the contractors, is not the agency that has any contact whatsoever with the contractors. That was one of the perhaps unintended consequences of the reforms under reinventing government of the Clinton era. It created these big mega contracts. And so really all you needed was this hunting license. If you were one of these bestowed anointed companies, really then all you needed was a hunting license to get these little task orders, which could be anywhere from nothing at all to hundreds of millions of dollars. So the effect of that is that what happens is that there's a whole new system of networking behind the scenes that takes place between contracting officials and government officials. So it's ushered in a new ways of doing things that are network based and less transparent. Norman Birnbaum.
Okay. Okay, I'm Norman Birnbaum from Georgetown on the one hand, The Nation magazine on the other. It's a useful synthesis. Look, your talk, Janine, reminded me of similar phenomena, perhaps, in other countries. Establishment in Britain, anox in France, behind the old Iron Curtain nomenclatura. And the interesting things about some of these groups is that they acted with an ideology of public responsibility. They were conscious of their obligations to some priority independent of the maintenance in power and privilege of the group. Do the people you study in the States have some ideology of public responsibility, like a kind of thing you might find in any annual report by a foundation president?
Very interesting question. The players that I've charted and defined as Flexians or FlexNets are loyal to their own, and I have defined them as having an ideology. They do have, or having at least an agenda. They do. It's not just about making money. They do have an agenda about public policy, but that is what's striking about it, is that I think cannot be considered to be a public agenda. They don't see themselves as doing, as working on behalf of the public good. But ideology is, of course, a very important part of what propels the Neocon Core forward, and I think has certainly been a large part of their success. I mean, of course, it's the modus operandi that's made them successful, but the ideology has helped move them forward. But Flexians, as I've defined them, do four things. They personalize bureaucracy. So when they're in bureaucracies, they work through networks. They personalize those bureaucracies. They privatize official information, and they brand their convictions. Branding is an extremely important part of all this, which separates these players from those of the past. I mean, they can brand appearances of the moment. They can brand their convictions much more easily, and the performance aspect is crucial. They juggle roles and representation. So they're always thinking about their roles and blending and their roles and representations. And then the effect is that they relax rules at the interstices of official and private institutions. They're always working that state-private nexus. They're always working the state-private networks. And when they work together in groups, when they work as a FlexNet, they have this informal, exclusive network that is self-propelling and enduring. It's self-propelling. They draw their membership from a limited circle of people that keeps coming up in different incarnations. They coordinate resources, and both physical and interpersonal, material and interpersonal resources. And then they help form a kind of a hybrid habitat as a result of relaxing rules at the interstices of official and private institutions. Sir, in the front.
Yeah, I'm Anton Chaitkin with LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review. I think the relationships that you're describing are showing up in the wrecked and collapse phase of the globalism that we've had for the last several decades. The Russians just recently signed a series of agreements with the Chinese for huge infrastructure deals using a lot of Chinese money, going in the direction that LaRouche is proposing of getting rid of this globalist system that's collapsed and replacing it with a four powers agreement, the United States, Russia, China, and India, to build up a modern world again, to go back to infrastructure and base it on sovereign nations and ditch the globalism, ditch the empire altogether. What's your response to that?
Thank you for your comment. So I'll think about it. Sir, in the front. Sorry. Yeah.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. What do you think of the idea of perhaps a website, disclosure.com, to do the same thing that has become actually standard in medical research now, that each writer has to provide a disclosure and any possible conflicting interests and so on. And maybe not to expect some of the people you're talking about immediately to sign on to this kind of thing, but to do it in a voluntary way. Start with people who are commenting on economic matters and financial matters, and then gradually maybe move over to the political science types and so on. What do you think about that as a way of handling what you're talking about?
Well, I think that those are very good strategies, and there are many, perhaps not quite like that, but there are many such, public interest organizations who work precisely along those lines and are disclosing many things about in all sectors, whether it's contracting out, whether it's revolving door, or what is now called the evolving door. But the issue is what does it matter? What does it change? Who cares? What comes out of it? The same players keep coming up and back up and keep wielding power and influence. So what does that say? On the one hand, they raise eyebrows. On the other hand, tongues may click in disapproval, but on the other hand, many people admire them or overlook that. It doesn't matter. They're effective. These players are there because they're effective. They get things done. Sir. Yeah.
Philip Farah with the GAO. It sounds like you've done some looking into the role of audit agencies. My question is, to what extent do you think the audit agencies, government audit agencies in this country, elsewhere, are immune to the influence of these flex networks? And what would be like some of the initial steps in retooling the audit agencies to be more effective in dealing with the networks?
Well, if you're with GAO, then you're a much better person to answer the question that you just posed. I certainly have I found a lot of GAO audits very useful in terms of understanding the nitty-gritty of government contracting, what's being contracted out, how much, and even understanding the relationships. I think one of the questions is what comes of it, of these kinds of investigations. I found what they've done, and say what the comparable body in Poland has done to be very helpful, very very effective. And the Polish GAO is really a model in that, is seen as a model in the region. What I would like to know more about, and what I think audits seem ill-equipped to deal with, are the players. They're more able to deal with the system. I mean, the first question was, have I named names, right? I mean, they're much more able to deal with systemic issues than with the players themselves, which of course also is a systemic issue. But in order to follow these players who are not visible, who are not necessarily not doing anything illegal, probably. I mean, they're about influence. They're not about money, right? I mean, who's equipped to really get to the bottom of that? That's the question. I mean, as I said, the investigation that ensued from the story about the retired generals Barry Mccaffrey et al. Was focused on whether taxpayer dollars were misused. That was not the point. The far greater harm, as far as I'm concerned, is influence. It's a new system of power and influence, right? So we're not talking about the old variety corruption. These players are beyond corruption. They're not engaged in fixed roles where I'm the official and you're bribing me. That's old school. They're far too sophisticated for that. They also are practicing the evolving door as opposed to the revolving door. So the door sort of disappears. See, I think the gentleman behind you, sorry, has it. Yeah.
Basically, I wanted to thank Janine publicly for the two excellent books. The first one about doing reform in Eastern Europe and in Russia, and the current one we're still having to look at. But it's an excellent presentation,
Thank you.
and I just want to say a few words about myself. I'm George Krasnow. I'm a former defector from the Soviet Union, and I'm naturalized American citizen, have been here a major part of my life. I'm bicultural. That's why I especially appreciate that the best book about doing reform in Russia was written by anthropologists. By the way, I'm also anthropologist, because I realized a huge cultural disconnect, especially noticeable in Russia, because we assume, just because Russians look like us and drive similar cars, we assume the similarity of our cultures. That was a huge reason for the mistakes made in the 90s. And of course, those reforms which were done, she was right, there's a great connection between the two books. Those reforms were done essentially by the Shadow Elite. So it hurt Russia. So that's why, well, currently I am president of Association of Americans for Friendship with Russia. And it's hard going. The Russians don't trust us anymore because we damaged Russia so much with the help of Shadow Elite in the 90s. Don't trust us anymore. So my basic question is about the interconnection of the two books. And you started very well by saying that there's indeed, we Americans learned some of the undemocratic or even command economy ways from Poland, from Russia, etc., and transplanted here to some extent, even if criminality is not enough here, that we have to borrow it from abroad. Okay, and actually I recommended your first book to be translated Russian, but it's not translated. So it's one achievement of American democracy, at least we can discuss that, because corruption there even greater than here. So the question is basically about some of the flexions, continuity of them from one book to another. And one of them is maybe Larry Summers, Robert Rubin. You mentioned them about their role in the Russian reform. Is there any? Would you still call them among the flexions?
Well, I think the important thing about my experience in Eastern Europe for many, more than 30 years. I was 12 when I started. Is that again, this, you have a command system and it breaks down. And I mean, just in a simple nutshell, what happens? The networks that have always helped everything work, people gotten what they need when there were always shortages in a centrally planned system, as well as the economy itself could not have functioned without these. Without this wheeling and dealing. I mean, Janusz Kornai, noted Harvard professor, has economist, has written the definitive works about how economies of shortage and how they functioned under, in real terms. And so it's this, how things function in real terms. You move that forward, and you have new systems that are being brought in, that are being implemented. You still have the infrastructure of how things work in these very tight-knit networks of people who are adjusting to and shaping the new system. At the same time, you have the privatization and the other schemes of the West that are being implemented in that part of the world. And so that's really, I think, how I learned to see what is going on in a different context, because that's where you see the play in. That's the most dramatic case of where you can see visibly the play of activity is where state and private come together. Market and bureaucracy, state and private power get intertwined, and the most effective, influential people are those who were, and sometimes ethically challenged, are those who are working right at that nexus. So of course, today there are several additional very, very important parts of the puzzle, two other transformational developments, not just the redesign of governing and the end of the Cold War, but today we also have information technologies, new information technologies, and truthiness, which is at least in part a result of that, which create, an even more complex dynamic. So I would say that's where I saw this system, the 90s, early 90s, where I saw the system in the current sort of system as it is evolving now in the making. And interestingly, some of the same players who were active there on the transnational scene in the previous book, I had a chapter and wrote about the Harvard advisors who, a few of whom, Jeffrey Sachs would be a classic Flexian, and remains so today in his dealings with the United Nations, from what I understand. That is, there's this ambiguity of official private relations. So you never know, is he speaking as a UN or as he's, you never know which hat he's wearing, which of course is a very, very effective strategy, and that's the way you should operate if you want to, be effective. So some of these players we saw both from the Russian side and the American side working together very, very closely in Eastern Europe, and employing the same modus operandi that they're now employing here in the United States, and that's been fascinating to observe. Another interesting part of this is that some of the journalists who really were telling the truth about the oligarchies, and officials who were telling the truth about the oligarchies that were developing in the early 90s in Poland power structure and the effects of the privatization schemes, are some of the same people that are now writing about the financial crisis here. And I think equipped to understand it, in part because they had their eyes open, they had their feet on the ground and their eyes open when they were looking at that system. Yeah, sir.
Where do you place the WTO in the architecture of networks that you described? Where do you place the WTO in the Segundo Mercado Llorenza, I'm a government affairs consultant. Where do you place the WTO in the architecture of the networks that you describe?
Unfortunately, I could certainly put you in touch with people who could speak much more definitively about that. I frankly don't know enough. One would want to look at the services agreements and various things. I really don't feel qualified to speak to that. Perhaps, Michael, would you? Yeah, no, okay. Sorry, yeah. Sorry, the lady in the front. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Kay Halpern. I'm also with the Government Accountability Office, and my colleague Phil's question got me to thinking, and in terms of how to address this issue and your points about how government accountability, government auditing organizations like GAO, how they have limited jurisdiction, and they're not, for the most part, when we do audits, we're not looking at who is influencing policy. That's not what we're supposed to be looking at. And then it got me to thinking, well, we get our marching orders from Congress, from congressional committees, and of course, congressional committees, there's an evolving door there, and I would just be interested in your comment on the extent to which a body like GAO, given that we work for Congress, would be able to investigate such issues.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, there are two problems. One is the issue of, it's not just that we don't ask the question of who. It's that we don't often get the importance of that question. I mean, Russians and many other people in the world automatically ask that question, but it's not really an American question. An American question is more what? What policy? What policy? Is it state? Is it private? So the idea of asking who and what are their roles and what are their activities is just anathema to the way we think. And that is not going to serve us in figuring out and maneuvering this new system of power and influence, because the new system it's not stable and it's not visible. So the first question is a thought, is just...
Even asking the question
Yeah.
is admitting that our system of government has some serious flaws. That these problems are falling through the cracks, that our system of balance of powers and transparent democratic government was meant to, negate.
Right. It doesn't conform to the way we want to think about ourselves in democracy. And of course, every organization, including GAO, is constrained and enabled, right? And GAO is constrained by the people who set it up and the people who run it. And of course, these questions can be very delicate. And I've seen GAO do some very good work over the years that I've been following things. I do know that the GAO report that came out 1996, it was the first. I mean, I was writing about this web of interlocking Russian-American relationships that were heavily involved in economic reforms in Russia, and GAO did an investigation. Later, I think they came out with a report in 1996, and I mean, I knew the staff people. I knew we were talking. We were sharing information. And I saw the first report. In fact, when the leader of the team retired, he gave it to me. He called it the Bible. I've got the Bible. I'm going to put it on my website as soon as I can get somebody to scan it all in. But then my point is that my point is that the report that then came out was very different from the report, and that the staff people actually did a very good job, very competent job. They looked at many of the right things and asked the right questions. But and I was told that had to do with their legal counsel and so on, which. Well, and of course, who is going to stand up to Harvard Harvard attorneys? That is a very, very, very powerful set. So, the gentleman in the front, yeah.
Yeah, Chachin, freelance correspondent. In the beginning, if you don't mention East Europe, I saw you talk about United States, but later
I
did.
missed the beginning of what you said.
In the beginning, you mentioned the East Europe country.
Yes.
If you don't mention, I thought you talk about United States, but later you did derive to the United States. I would like to inject one thing. I think this is the new way of governance. We use a military man as an example. Retired general is quite a trust, and then he has a network and a friend in the inside the Pentagon. And when Pentagon wants something, then he give him the information. And this retired general, usually he has his own institution or he attached to the foundation. And then when this person inside the Pentagon wants something, and then he give this retired general information and what he want, and then he project the idea to the media or to the general public. So that's is working together. And I think this is a new way of governance. Yeah. And particularly this is based on the personal relation.
Right.
So from our talking now, this not just exists in United States, it exists in East Europe, and it exists in Russia.
Right.
So this is a human being issue.
Yeah, one of the features of this new system seems to be the informalization in the networks about everything. I mean, that's why my first feature of Flexians is personalizing bureaucracy. They're not getting rid of it necessarily, but they're personalizing it. They're supplanting it. The other issue that comes out of what you say is, how widespread is this? And I mean, it's a research question. I don't know. What I do know is that wherever I go and speak about this, mostly in Europe, and not only Eastern Europe, people come up to me or they say, but this is exactly what's going on, or this part of it is exactly what's going on in my country. So I think this is the agenda. Certainly one of the agendas that we're left with.
One more question?
Oh, okay. One more question. The lady who's walking.
I'm a representative of the invisible back of the room.
Okay.
My name is Barbara Krimgold. I'm from the Center for Advancing Health. And an area where I'm concerned, I've been a Fed also, is with the role of the media. And I'm concerned about the decline of investigative journalism and the replacement of investigative journalism with talking heads and self-described experts, a very limited number of the same talking heads we see over and over and over, who are selling their opinion, their agenda, and their book. And as well as some books, there are those of us who appreciate the books that tell us things we need to know, but clearly it's not reaching the general voting population. And sort of deep investigative journalism about these flexions and networks and the power elites. And I wonder if you have thoughts about the role of the media or recommendations or ways in which we, the public, might demand more accountability and a better, more information that will help us understand facts rather than just be entertained by the political economic entertainers.
Right. Well, we're in a truthiness society, and part of the problem is that, there are sources of information, and there are, lots of websites and public interest organizations that really put some of these things together and do a very good job. But I think a real issue for us is what results from it, and how much do we really care? I mean, how do you change a situation in which appearances of the moment account for so much, and track records that somebody might have, and the fact that they said something totally different yesterday, and facts don't exist in the same way, don't have the same authority that they used to have. I mean, how do you change that? I mean, the fact that parody is often, the programs that are parodies, that are entertainment on TV, Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, sometimes are more incisive and truthful than the news. So, I mean, what is that about? I mean, a Russian colleague of mine has actually written a piece about precisely how it was in the Soviet Union, I'm not going to recap the argument, but I mean, this is not a new phenomenon in history, but it's happening here, and apparently not only here and not only there in history, but other places. So I mean, these are really questions that we as a society and a culture have to address. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Janine.
Yeah.
Woodell.